Our Swedish Ancestors, Part 2. So why would they leave their beautiful, ancestral Sweden? This is their story. While in Sweden, Anders Peterson and Christina Svensdotter, his second wife, joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1871. Next, Anders' daughter Emily Charlotte joined in 1872. Then, his son Carl August and Carl's wife Fredrika joined in 1873. The youngest, Hilda Sophia, joined in 1874. And last, Anders' oldest child Peter, who joined in 1883. Anders had 3 married daughters who didn't join the church. They remained in Sweden when the rest of the family left for Zion. Their names were Karen, Mathilda, and Christina. This is Karen, one of Anders' daughters that remained in Sweden, and her husband, Carl Tigner. When Carl August and Fredrika Andersson joined the church in 1873 in Aurugerum, Blekinge, Sweden, they had 2 children, Martin Emanuel, age 4, and Ernest, age 2. It would be 9 years and 4 babies later before anyone in the Andersson family could leave for Zion in America. Those 4 babies born to Carl and Fredrika were Alfrida Charlotte, born in 1874, Annette Sophia, born in 1876, a stillborn daughter, born in 1879, and Jacob Emanuel, born 1880. Carl August's wife, Fredrika Karlsdotter, was born 25th of March, 1842, in Kabetol, Söderåkra, to Carls Johnson and Maria Petersdotter. Fredrika's parents and siblings never joined the church in their lifetimes. Her father, Carl, died in 1881, 2 years before Fredrika left for Zion in 1883. Her mother, Maria, died in 1863. Before Carl August left for America, his 2 oldest children, Martin and Ernest, were baptized into the church in September 1881. Martin was 11 years old, and Ernest was 9. The rest of his children would all be baptized later in Utah. A missionary who was serving in their Sweden branch, Elder John Olson, had been asked by his brother Andrew to find him a sweet Swedish girl who would agree to come to America. Andrew would pay her steamship passage and then marry her. Andrew Olson was well-to-do financially. He had a nice home and a ranch in southern Utah in Beaver City, where he employed men to work on his property, but he had a hump on his back. Emma decided to take the chance and meet Andrew Olson. Finally, in 1882, Carl August, now 40 years old, and his 6-year-old daughter, Annette Sophia, and Carl's sister, Emily Charlotte, called Emma, aged 24, all prepared to leave their homeland of Sweden, leaving the rest of their family to come later. Carl, Annette, and Emma crossed the ocean by ship, traveled across the United States by train, and found their way to Zion in the territory of Utah. They headed for Beaver City, near St. George, arriving in 1882. Emma must have liked Andrew, because they were married on the 23rd of November, 1882, in the St. George Temple, the same year she arrived in Utah. They were very happy. They had a lovely home, and he always lavished clothes and jewels on his wife. 6-year-old Nettie stayed with Andrew and Emma while her father, Carl August, sought work in Murray, Utah, at the smelter there. Carl August needed to earn enough to pay the way for the rest of the family to come to Zion.
A side note about Murray, Utah's smelter. The area of Murray remained agricultural until 1869, when ore was found in Park City, Utah, and additional ore deposits were found in Little Cottonwood Canyon. Because of Murray's central location and access to the railroad, the first smelter was built there in 1870, and Murray became home to some of the largest smelters in the region over the next 30 years. In 1870, Murray produced the first silver bars smelted in Utah. Many of those employed at the smelters were immigrants from Scandinavian countries who had joined the LDS Church in their homeland and moved to Utah. Most spoke with little English. The Scandinavian population settled in the area west of State Street. There they had a meeting house large enough to hold separate services in the Swedish language. The Scandinavians eventually dispersed. Few ethnic reminders remain in this section of Murray today. Smelting is a process of applying heat to ore in order to melt out a base metal. It is used to extract many metals from ores, including silver, iron, copper, and other base metals. Smelting uses heat and a chemical reducing agent to decompose the ore, driving off other elements as gases or slag and leaving the metal base behind. Now back to our Swedish ancestors.
Carl August worked at the smelter in Murray, Utah, and in 1 year raised enough money to send for his family. Those who came later in 1883 were Carl's father, Anders Peterson, now aged 69, Carl's wife, Fredrika, now age 41, Carl's children, Martin Emanuel, age 14, and Ernest, age 12, Alfreda Charlotte, age 9, and Jacob Emanuel, age 3. Carl's sister, Hilda Sophia, age 20. John Olson, the missionary in Sweden, was the head of the company of saints that came in 1883. There were about 1,002 passengers on their ship, the SS Nevada. The rest of our Swedish family coming to America was part of this company. In the History of Anders Peterson by Pearl Williams Hood, it states, quote, "While they were crossing the ocean, a terrible storm came up. This lasted 3 days. No one was allowed on deck. They suffered from seasickness. People had to hang on to ropes and straps to keep from being thrown out of their beds. There was a great clatter among the dishes and banging as the trunks and baggage were thrown back and forth in the compartment where they were stored. But Anders Peterson and his daughter Hilda often said that they never once doubted that they would come over safely to Zion." Unquote. The journey from Sweden to America was a long one. They traveled across the Atlantic Ocean by ship and from New York City by train to Murray, Utah, arriving in Utah about September of 1883.
A side note about emigrants traveling by train from New York to the West. By 1869, the first transcontinental line linking the coasts was finally completed. Suddenly, a journey that had previously taken months using horses could be made in less than a week. 5 days after the first transcontinental railroad was completed, daily passenger service over the rails began. The speed and comfort offered by the rail travel was so astonishing that many Americans could scarcely believe it. And popular magazines wrote glowing accounts of the amazing journey. For the wealthy, a trip on the Transcontinental Railroad was a luxurious experience. First-class passengers rode in beautifully appointed cars with plush velvet seats that converted into snug sleeping berths. The finer amenities included steam heat, fresh linen daily, and gracious porters who catered to their every whim. For an extra $4 a day, the wealthy traveler could opt to take the weekly Pacific Hotel Express, which offered first-class dining on board. As one happy passenger wrote, "The rarest and richest of all my journeying through life is this 3,000 miles by rail." The trip on the Transcontinental Railroad was a good deal slower and less comfortable for passengers unwilling or unable to pay the first-class fare. The third-class occupants were often emigrants, hoping to make a new start in the West. A third-class ticket could be purchased for $40. That's less than half the price of the first-class fare. At this low rate, the traveler received no luxuries. Their cars, fitted with rows of long, narrow wooden benches, were congested, noisy, and uncomfortable. The railroad often attached these coach cars to their freight cars, and they were constantly shunted aside to make way for the express trains. Consequently, the third-class traveler's journey west might have taken 10 days or more. Even under these trying conditions, few travelers complained. Even 10 days spent sitting on a hard bench seat was preferable to 6 months walking alongside a wagon on the Oregon Trail. Now back to our Swedish ancestors.
Carl August rented a home and the family lived in Murray for about 6 months. Then, in the spring of 1884, they rented a home from Bishop Benyon in Taylorsville, Utah. Carl worked for the Benyons there. On the 11th of July, 1884, in Taylorsville, Carl August and Frederica had their last child, the only one born in America, a baby girl they named Jenny Anderson. 70 years old, Anders Peterson and his youngest daughter, 20-year-old Hilda, were in Beaver City, living with his daughter, Emma Olson. Anders lived there the rest of his life. Carl's oldest boys, Martin, 14, and Ernest, 12 or 13, also went to work on the Olson farm in Beaver. Ernest stated he had only gone to school for 3 years while living in Augerum, Blekinge, Sweden. He had to support himself after coming to America. During his first years in America, he found it very difficult to master English. He often told of practicing with a copybook while herding sheep with his brother Martin. It must have been very difficult for all the family to master the English language and get used to a new culture and its different climate. After 2 years in Taylorsville, Carl August and the rest of his family moved to southern Utah, 20 miles south of Beaver City, in a place far away from anywhere, called Pine Creek, Utah. Life was good because the family was together, but challenging because of the distance from any church members or meeting houses. They made every effort to live the gospel they loved. At Jake's funeral, Carl's son, Lawrence Williams remarked, Carl Anderson would have his family all get dressed up in their best on Sundays, and he would read to them from the Bible. Living in the middle of nowhere was tough for Carl's son, Ernest, who stated, when he finally left Pine Creek years later, that he never, ever wanted to look back. It was so desolate. The St. George Temple was dedicated on April 6, 1877, so it was open and functioning by the time Anders moved to Beaver City. Anders left his kindred, friends, and native land and came to America. He never regretted the step he had taken. He went to the St. George Temple, where he had his 3 wives sealed to him for time and eternity, on the 19th of September, 1884. He loved this country and was happy living with his daughter Emma Olson in southern Utah. Also working on the Andrew Olson farm were the teenaged Williams brothers, Ezra, Joseph, and Parley. They were industrious, honest, and devout to the gospel of Jesus Christ. They first began herding the town cows, then went to Pine Creek and herded bucks for Andrew Olson, who later gave them a job herding sheep on shares or accepting sheep as pay. They were careful and worked hard. Ezra, Joseph, and Parley had almost everything in common, even one best suit of clothes which fit each of them equally well. Each partner took turns wearing this suit when he had business to transact in Beaver. Emma Olson told her little sister Hilda of a fine young man who was working on the ranch because she felt these two should meet. His name was Ezra Thomas Williams, and he had curly auburn hair. Ezra writes in his journal, July 14, 1885, quote, "After visiting with my stepfather and dear old mother in Taylorsville, I bid them adieu and took a train from Black Rock, and I arrived at about 7 p.m. Here I found Charlie, who had brought Andrew Olson's carriage in which to take me back to Pine Creek. He was accompanied by Miss Hilda Peterson, who had come to greet me on my arrival. We arrived at Pine Creek about noon the next day, after traveling through about 30 miles of desert and buying water for our horses at Antelope Spring." A month later, Ezra writes, Sunday, 16th of August, quote, "Went to Bishop Charles White's and obtained a recommend to the temple." August 13th, 1885, quote, I and Miss Hilda Peterson started for St. George. The next day, on the 31st, we found that our recommends had not got back from Salt Lake City, where we had sent them to have them signed by President John Taylor, so I concluded we'd have to wait. So we headed back so I could help Brother John Lang haul peas. On the 1st of September, Hilda and I left Beaver for St. George, where we arrived on the 4th. At the temple we were married by President John McAllister, President McAllister having first ordained me to the office of elder. We started home on the 5th and arrived on the 9th. About a week after we came back, we had a supper and a dance, after which I went to herd the sheep in Wildcat Canyon. This ends Ezra's journal. As it happens, the Williams brothers did establish their own sheep business. Selling wool and lambs, the three of them bought a ranch at Pine Creek, Utah. They would take turns at the sheep camp, tending the flocks. Ezra and Hilda went to live on this ranch at Pine Creek. In 1891, Martin and Ernest went to work on the Williams' ranch for these three brothers. Carl August's oldest brother, Peter, arrived from Sweden in 1890, according to the 1900 census, and lived with his sister, Emma Olsen. He was the last of the family to come to America. He was 50 years old at the time. Tragedy struck the family. First, Grandpa Anders died 13th of November, 1890, when he was 76 years old, and he was buried in the Beaver City Cemetery in Beaver City. Then Carl and Frederica's little daughter Jenny died 11th of October, 1891, of pneumonia at age 7, and was buried next to her Grandpa Anders Peterson in Beaver City. Emma's husband Andrew Olson died 2nd of April, 1898, and was buried in Salt Lake County, Utah. He was only 41 years old. After his death, Emma moved to Brigham City, Utah. Of the three Williams brothers, only Ezra was married. The other brothers, they began courting Alfreda Anderson, called Frida, and a girl named Mary Jane Lillywhite. In Martin's history it states, Frida was being courted by Parley, and Joseph was courting Jane. The brothers decided to exchange partners, so Joseph started courting Frida and married her in the St. George Temple in 1891. Jane Lillywhite courted Parley until she became acquainted with Frida's handsome brother, Martin, whom she married. Martin was 23 and Mary Jane was 17. They married in 1892. Parley Williams remained single for the rest of his life. There's only speculation why he remained single. Jacob Anderson, Carl August's youngest son, known as Jake, also never married. Ernest, at age 20, while herding sheep in Beaver County, met his future wife, Millie Mae Neal, and they were married 5 years later in 1895 in the Salt Lake Temple. Annette, called Nettie, at age 30 married Warren Parks Lindsay of Moreland, Idaho in 1906. Warren Parks had lost 2 previous wives to death. He had 6 children, ages ranging from 8 to 19. In the 1900 census, Nettie was living in Brigham City with her sister, Emma Olsen. It is unknown how Nettie met Warren Parks Lindsay, but I do know that Warren traveled to Salt Lake to stay with his second wife while she was in hospital for months just before her death in 1900. Also, the Williams brothers took their sheep to Idaho for grazing. Maybe their wives or some of the Anderson family went with them. All I know is Nettie married Warren on October 4th, 1906, and became a wonderful mother to the 6 motherless children. The year 1893 was a difficult one for ranchers. There was a terrible panic because of considerable scabies among the sheep. Only 2 sheep outfits in the whole country didn't go broke at that time. The Williams brothers took hay to the sulfur mine and traded it for sulfur to dip the sheep with. They built a dipping vat and ran it for all the other ranchers in the area. In that way, they made enough to finance their sheep outfit. 3 years later, in 1896, the Williams brothers sold the Pine Creek property. Ezra and Joseph built homes in Taylorsville, Utah, near Salt Lake, and decided to graze their sheep up in Idaho. This new arrangement was hard on their little families. The men were gone in Idaho with their flocks for long periods of time. Most of us can't imagine how hard life was in those days, especially in places so desolate like Pine Creek, Utah, and the long months of separation while the men tended to their flocks in Idaho. Ranching and farming was difficult anyway, but I'm sure it was easier because the Andersons and the Williams worked together, helping each other. At Jake's funeral, it was said, all those relatives did their work well. They were thorough, and their work was always finished right. Also, all the families were always very loyal to each other.
This is the end of our Swedish Family Part 2, Coming to Zion and Life in America. A special thanks to Scott Kittleson for his narration, to Ryan Kittleson for his reading of The Smelting and Immigration by Train, and a thanks to Catherine Lamoureux for her artwork of the wooden benches in the third-class trains.